Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education information to inspire collaboration and action. With me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco. Coming up, we have Blair Palese joining us from Australia to talk about carbon pricing around the world and the new Australian carbon exchange. But first, of course, we have this month's Green Jobs Report. And just as a little bit of introduction to that, as we have probably all seen, the IEA has had a massive new report out suggesting that really radical action needs to be taken to end investment in developing new fossil fuel resources. Of course, this is no surprise to anyone who's followed this. That's been talked about by a lot of people for a long time, but the IEA has been going for nearly 50 years and has finally come out with some really strong statements around this. And indeed, it's been widely reported in the press. This comment from, as the FT picked it up, really brings all of this home. Of course, many in the industry have fought back against that and are no doubt saying perhaps we should go more slowly. But I guess with that as the introduction, I will hand over to Paul Herman, who's in the West Coast, to take us into the Green Jobs Report, because of course the other thing in the IEA report is that all of this investment will create significant economic opportunity. So with that, over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Nigel. Welcome everyone to ESGX.org. We're delighted to have all of you with us. Our monthly Green Jobs Report will be led by Amir Khaleghi, a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and you'll all be familiar with him from sharing this report the past year. And you'll start to see some green shoots of recovery blend in, including from some lower HIP-rated industries. And that's as some of the high contact industries start to come back in hospitality and casinos and the like. So, and then also I'll just put in the chat, if you're looking for your summer reading list for ESG, I had a feature on the best ESG books for your summer reading. So check those out. And Amir, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for those of you who are joining us today for our monthly Green Jobs Report. Our monthly Green Jobs Report provides a data-driven analysis that synchronizes industry data that is provided by the Current Employment Statistics Survey and with company data that's provided by Paul and his team at HIP Investor. They have a catalog of companies of over 2,000 companies that are all rated with a human impact plus profit rating. These ratings are based on the performance, products, and management practices of these companies with detailed metrics on health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust pillars. This data is then synchronized to industrial data that is provided by the Current Employment Statistics Survey, which is a survey that is produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then once all of this is done, each industry will be given a weighted average based on the companies that are displayed within those various industries, which gives a HIP-rated weight. Oh. Hold on one second. So the greenness of industries will vary based on their human impact plus profit rating. Some of the examples are highly rated industries, medium rated industries, and low rated industries are provided by the bullet points below. But what we have found consistently is that greener jobs within greener industries have been the most resilient to job loss given the onset COVID-19 crisis. So looking at this graph here, it displays the percent change of employment for each human impact plus profit bucket, comparing the February 2020 level to the March 2021 level. And when looking, we can see that proportionally, greener rated industries have been the least impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, with a reduction of 3.77%, while the lowest tiered industries, the most extractive industries, have had the highest proportional job loss with a reduction of 7% when comparing to the February 2020 level. So taking a monthly look, we can see here from this graph that the most significant job reduction was from March 2020 to April 2020, with a jobs reduction of over 20 million, and then a subsequent return of jobs of 3.3 million from April 2020 to May 2020. But fast forwarding to this month, we saw a gain of over 700,000 jobs from February 21 to March 2021. But we see here that the lowest tiered bucket, most extractive industries saw the highest proportional change of this month, but this is driven by lower rated travel industries, which are driving gains in extractive industries. So looking here at the quick facts, we can see that there were gains across many of the extractive industries, including gambling or amusement parks that have a lower HIP score, and the higher proportional return of travel industries. Unfortunately, some of them are lower rated, which attributes to the higher proportional gain in the lower rated HIP scores. But as of positive news, 144 of the 191 industries that are analyzed within our green jobs report saw growth over the months of February to March. And for a quick overview of the macro numbers, the total private employment count for March 2021 is at 122.5 million, which is 6.9 million jobs below the February 2020 level of employment. Looking at the top industry gainers and top industry losers in regard to employment, we can see here that restaurants, amusement services, and college universities had the highest absolute amount of employment gain. So restaurants had an increase of 82,000 jobs. Amusement services, which, for example, are like theme parks, amusement parks, saw a gain of 61,000, and colleges and universities saw an increase of 56,000. The top industry losers were building and material suppliers, which saw a reduction of 15,000, television broadcasting, which saw a reduction of 8,000, and grocery stores, which saw a reduction of 5,000. But when looking at the whole macro numbers, it is really positive. There were more proportional, a great extent, more proportional job gains within industries across the entire economy. So given that, it is very positive, although it is unfortunate that these travel industries are so lowly rated, given perhaps the way that their employees are treated, the health services that the employees are provided, or perhaps the detrimental environmental impacts that are a result of the services that are provided by the various industries within the travel and accommodation sector. So moving forward, looking at this graph here, it's focused on products and services as opposed to the overall human impact and profit rating. And still, the driver of gain within the lower tiered industries is driven by the low rated travel industries. We see here that over the course of February to March, that the lowly rated industries saw a gain of 2.29%, which is the highest proportional gain. But again, this is driven by steep increases in extractive travel industries such as gambling industries, which has seen a gain of 13,000 jobs since January 2021, which is an 18.2% increase. While additionally, support activities for mining has also seen increases of 14.7 thousand jobs, equating to a 6% increase within this industry as well. But notably, there are many more positive, net beneficial products and services that are provided within the industries of the US economy, and the lowest 0 to 25 bucket only constitutes 2% of the entire employment pool. Something that's also noted throughout all of our green jobs report is that industries within the highest, most green, net beneficial, human impact plus profit rating industries is that they pay significantly more. We can see here that comparing the levels, green jobs have consistently paid more, but over the change from February to March, there wasn't much price action across all the buckets. Green industries did decrease by 9 cents from February to March. Over the same period, slightly extractive industries increased by 2 cents per hour, whereas extremely extractive industries saw no change within their average hourly earnings. For the last portion of our green jobs analysis, it mimics the high contact and low contact analysis that was provided by the St. Louis Fed. So, for example, the St. Louis Fed looked at the occupational survey and created designations for high contact and low contact industry sectors. High contact industry sectors contain occupations which require work to be within 1 arm's length, whereas low contact industry sectors contain occupations which allow for social distancing. And we can see here that high contact industry sectors have a reduction of around 4.5 million as compared to their February 2020 level, whereas low contact industry sectors have a reduction of around 1.7 million. But the main takeaway here is that even when comparing low rated versus high rated HIP scores within the high contact and low contact industries, higher rated HIP industries were more resilient to job loss, even within the high contact industry sectors. We can see that here by looking at the graph. Those that are below 30 HIP score have a significant are significantly higher proportionally as compared to the above 30 HIP scores for both low and high contact industries, which is just another bullet point towards the resiliency of higher rated HIP scored industries. And with that being said,
I think it'll be insightful. Maybe next month we could, if this was revealing itself, we could take a look at what where there's any granularity in what people are being paid. Certainly there's some campaigns going on right now where the least paid aren't coming back to work at all, and they're just saying, I'm not going to take those jobs anymore. I'm going to find new, better paid jobs, maybe in better run companies, especially in restaurants and hospitalities. There's a few fast food chains that are suffering in that way.
Right.
So yeah, this is really insightful. So thanks for delving deeper into it.
No problem. That's a great idea. Definitely for next month's report, we can take a more granular look at the average hourly earnings for different industries and seeing how they're impacted, especially for travel industries and those of hospitality and leisure, such as restaurants. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Amir. Thanks for the monthly Green Jobs Report and a quick review for Marissa. And you can find more of this in the HIP Investor book or on the HIP Investor site, the types of industries that are being classified as green are those that pay people well, that are treating the planet in a more regenerative and sustainable way versus an extractive way, and that build trust, that aren't sued. So what that means is those industries are treating people better, planet better, and trust better. And part of that leadership is the carbon markets. So let's transition. I think Nigel's going to come back and give a global overview of some recent innovations and experiences in the carbon markets. Some of you in the U.S. may know that the Chicago Climate Exchange emerged, lived, and shut down. And so Nigel's going to share a little bit more of that history, and then Blair is going to come in and explain the latest from Australia, and then finally Fadhel and I will come back later in the program. So Nigel, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's obviously been quite a fascinating time in the world of carbon markets. And just as a little bit of background, here is one of the maps of where there are schemes. And of course, we all know above my head that Europe is covered by the EU ETS. There's lots of devil in the detail, of course, because precisely how this works in different industries is somewhat complicated. But that being said, we are now rapidly coming to the point where there is a more level playing field. Canada's scheme got through the Supreme Court there a couple of months ago, and there is now a legislated pathway to 150 Canadian dollars a tonne by 2030, and that for me is quite an eye-watering price. That makes many forms of carbon capture look like they could be economic, at least certainly some of the technologies we're working with. Of course, China has a scheme launched a little while ago, and Australia here is coloured in green, but it has some limited carbon pricing, and we'll come back to that. There are, of course, some sub-regional schemes. California's had a carbon price for some time, as an example. China ran a bunch of province-by-province schemes, which have now become a national scheme. And of course, important to remember for those outside the US has the 45Q tax credit, which gives you something like $35 a tonne if the CO2 is being used for enhanced oil recovery, and I think it's $50 a tonne if it's being actually stored, and there's prospects of all of that regime continuing to improve. If anyone has not been watching carbon pricing, particularly the green line here, and this goes right back to the beginning of the EU scheme, and there's a few big spikes, but the EU ETS scheme reached in mid-May almost 50 euros a tonne, and then if I just zoom in purely to Europe for the last 12 months, the price in Europe's gone from about 20 euros a tonne up to now over 50 euros a tonne, which is quite spectacular, and I think shows the implications of Europe now really is entering the next phase of the market, and all of the teeth are beginning to bite. So with that as introduction, I was going to hand out and just ask Blair, there's been a huge amount that has been going on in Australia over the last little while. There has been significant. It's a really confusing picture where you've got a federal government with one attitude, the state governments with a different attitude. Interested, just maybe give us your take on the big picture, and then we'll come to the carbon exchange, which has just been announced.
Sure. Yeah, I think, Nigel, you pretty much hit it off straight away with confused, I think is the word. And I guess you could say confused really only at the federal level, because to be honest, everything else is charging on, including businesses who are chomping at the bit, really sick to death of inaction at the federal level, which really at this point would be just getting out of the way, let alone setting up something that could send some good, clear market signals and direct some federal funding in an appropriate way that backed up that kind of interest. And as you see, all of these companies, and this is a fraction of the companies that over the last 10 years have been actively negotiating and involved in how they'll cope and work with climate and potentially a price.
Yeah, and I thought I'd just put this graphic up. This is the Australian members of the RE100, which is a global initiative You've got all four of Australia's big four banks, and they're all in the world's top 50 banks. Macquarie, that most people would know, Suncorp, another big bank and insurance business, QBE, one of the biggest insurance companies, Atlassian, Australia's largest technology company, two of the biggest property companies, CCA, which is the local bottler of Coke, Woolworths, one of the two big retailers. So you've got the corporate sector that's really just started to do things by themselves. And where do you see that's going? Is there any other activity by other corporate representative groups?
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the more impressive is the power purchase agreements going on and science-based targets. So you could say that pretty much every large user of energy has already, if not one, maybe several PPAs have been agreed with direct into a renewables project in order to control electricity price specifically, but also to do the right thing, which is go around the federal government. And that's what most businesses are doing, most states are doing. The states certainly have net zero targets at various levels of year targets, 2050 and below, which means that virtually the whole country is moving and is working to transition literally against the lack of leadership at the federal level. So I'm not sure what a country comparative would be, but frustrated is an understatement. I was just at a 2-day smart energy conference last week with the kind of innovators and investors, companies producing and innovating into the space of all kinds of things, so not just energy, but related sectors and industries. And the frustration in the room was utterly palpable. and ironically, the carbon market that you're talking about was not mentioned at this conference. So it says a lot about what the heck is this no consultation? Is it a fig leaf in run up to COP? For the lack of other activities that the federal government isn't doing.
It's quite fascinating because we talked about this, on the show about 6 months ago, which is the geopolitics of, the US is under new management. The UK desperately needs a friend. Now they've left Europe. Europe's on its own path. Australia had nailed its colours to Trump's mast and he's gone. And Australia needs a friend somewhere. The UK wants a trade deal. How does it makes you wonder how to what extent has this come about because of corporate pressure, or has it come about because there's part of some backroom deal around a trade deal with the UK? Because of course Boris Johnson is he's on the same side of politics as Scott Morrison, but is on a reasonably radically green agenda.
Absolutely, and with there's no doubt in my mind that from his perspective and the UK post-Brexit, COP is critical to proving a success. So he is literally ringing countries that are dragging the chain, including Australia, on a regular basis to read them the Riot Act and say we want a net zero target by 2050 at the very least, and you need to rock up with that come Scotland in November at the COP meeting. So it's we're seriously between a rock and a hard place. And just the sort of insanity that's going on in Australia is that the day the IAE report came out, which was radical by anyone's take on the shift of that organization from being literally a front for the fossil fuel sector to declaring its end and the need to rapidly move out of polluting energy and into clean and other alternatives. On that day, the federal government announced a $600 million prop-up of a gas sector project up in, it was strictly local politics, but to think about trying to prop up gas and to inject federal money, i.e. taxpayer money, into that, the day the IE says, that's the nail in the coffin, it pretty much sums up Australia's conundrum.
And so another thing, and this was not carbon related directly, but the Adani Carmichael mine has just had its water rights overturned. So this has been through the federal courts in Australia, thanks to one of the activist organisations, which has effectively forced there to be normal approval processes applied to the granting of massive water rights. So that will slow that whole program down by another year or two. So you've got kind of the governance somehow seems to be working. And if I was to put a positive spin on it, irrespective of the national politics, you've just got a lot of forces at work that are just getting on with it.
Absolutely.
The installation of solar PV last year in Australia was it 9 gigawatts? It's some massive
you know,
number.
highest household rooftop in the world. You know, people have embraced renewables, cannot understand what the federal government problem is. One of our you know, there's a lovely book written by one of our previous Greens politicians. He talks about the captured state here. And if you were going to come up with a textbook example of a country whose federal government is the captured state, because it's both sides of politics, it's labor as well as the liberals, simply cannot communicate, let go of the attachment to the fossil fuel sector or the Murdoch media in order to say, sorry, we have to cast that off, throw it off, and, you know, emerge from this COVID crisis with what is clearly working for so many countries, which is investment in green jobs and green innovation and green sectors. That's not happening here. We're investing in gas. I mean, you might as literally by doing that, flush that money down the toilet. It is a complete waste of taxpayer money in a time when investment into what comes next is critical. That's not happening here at the federal level. At the state level, absolutely. Even they are desperately trying to maneuver collectively and then competitively to things like green hydrogen, new jobs in sectors that can, you know, like little renewable hubs that can promote things like regional jobs in different things like IT. You know, it's changing quickly, and yet it's not changing at all. So COP will be a reckoning for this country, which will be really interesting. The carbon market seems to be a bit of this paint a picture that we're doing something, but in fact is clearly the fact that no one is talking about it in the climate sector in Australia, it says a lot about everyone kind of scratching their head and going, what's that, move on, you know?
I mean, it's quite fascinating, and maybe I'm a natural optimist with some of these things, but one construction of it, at least from where I sit, is if you create a market, then it gives the opportunity for new people to put products on there, possibly beyond the carbon units which are currently in existence in Australia. So there are 3 types, and I won't get into the weeds of what they are and where they come from, but they relate to various of the renewable energy schemes that have been running. But there's no reason, if you have a new exchange, why more people can't list products on there. Australia has massive capacity to produce carbon credits, for example, through either just planting a lot of trees, and there are places where that is ecologically possible, as I understand it. So there is the land and there is the water. It's also possible to drive significant carbon recapture in soils through more regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Both of those things could generate a lot of opportunity and create a lot of credits and allow the companies that want to buy these things in Australia and offshore to purchase them, and then the whole market could just sort of get on with it. And could this actually depoliticize everything?
No.
Okay, I'm optimistic.
No, I would say for the agriculture sector, there's a chance it could really play a part. In the mainstream business sector, where energy use and the players are and the investment money is, they're not talking about it, they're not interested. We tried this, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and in fact, people got their heads around and went, yeah, we could see how this could work. Without any federal leadership, they literally have gone on and created their own ways to make things work. So trying to tag something on at the back end of that is almost an insult to the intelligence of those who've found creative ways to kind of move forward. Look, I'm not saying it will or will not work. I think the biggest challenge when you say, why wouldn't it be something people grab on to use, it's because the lack of a federal market signal and the potential that they could change their mind next week on the whim of the mining industry, the Murdoch media, means that people just literally look at that and go, yeah, no, thanks. I'm not going to put my my energy into that. I mean, at Climate and Capital Media, we look, globally at what are the trends that drive the change. And without a doubt, at this point in time, the U.S.'s example of using COVID to plug huge amounts of money with a very strong market signal that this is the way it's going, these are the technologies, the regions, the areas we're going to support, is what businesses have really appreciated there and around the world. By muddying that water in Australia again for like the 400th time, industry truly is either going to think, how do we get them out of the way quickly, or how do we just get on with it on our own accord? And that's a frustration that we don't need.
Yeah, and look, and I'm going to ask Fadhel and Paul to join us up here and maybe take this a bit more geopolitical, because one of the other fascinating things here, of course, is the prospect of carbon border taxes, etc.
Exactly.
You know, China has been a very important export market for Australia for tourism and agriculture, and of course iron ore, and now even iron ore is coming in China's spotlights. Meanwhile, the exporter of that iron ore, Fortescue, Andrew Forrest's business, has committed to complete decarbonisation of its production of iron ore by, I think, 2030. So again, you've got a significant donor to the party in power who's on a path to decarbonise his iron ore business. He's putting a heap of money into hydrogen, and we might come back to that. But I'm fascinated in the geopolitics. So maybe, Fadhel, you might want to talk about this in the context of, you know, so Australia's there, lots of relationships, and important ones, with the island nations out in the Pacific, who, of course, are somewhat in the front line of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole discussion is really fascinating. People are sort of forgetting that we have less than 10 years to act on a massive scale, and people are thinking in a very small incremental way. Just to put things in context, also from an American perspective, from an oil and gas perspective, you have to remember that the oil and gas industry, the American Petroleum Institute in particular, has finally come out and endorsed a carbon tax as the thing that will work, that will fix everything, even though they were opposed to it. But because of the mounting pressure in the last few years on the American political system, the grassroots movements, the environmental movement, especially the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal movement, they finally realized that there's this momentum for a very transformative climate action program in the US and beyond. So in order to dismiss that, they went for the lowest hanging fruit from their perspective, which is being willing to go for a carbon tax, and then using it as a bargaining chip with the political establishment to say, look, we're working with you, we're working on climate change, now give us this, that, and the other. And their major concern is the regulation. They don't mind paying more because they can pass on the cost, and they can, but they're not happy with the regulatory framework that a real climate action would put in place. That is true in the US, and that is true globally. So we have to be aware of these parameters just because of the urgency of and the scale at which we have to intervene. Now, creating incentives, sending the right market signals, counting on innovation and technology and markets is a great thing, but it's not going to be sufficient. As many people have said in the last few weeks, that 50% of the emission reduction is going to come from future technology, but the other 50% has to come from action that we have to put in place today based on the resources that we have. And then finally, the last thing I want to put on the table for us to discuss is this implicit assumption that we hear over and over again, that the federal government doesn't have the financial resources to do this. So we need markets and private sector capital to help us plant trees and help us find solutions, market-based solutions. Again, coming from an MMT perspective, in the US and Australia and Canada, countries that have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, which many people have rediscovered during the pandemic, you can spend money into existence without having to tax or borrow it to meet a national emergency like the COVID crisis, and the climate crisis is one of those. So it's a myth that we say the federal government doesn't have the resources for reforestation or for investing in green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. So let's set the record straight. The Australian government, the American government, the Canadian government, and so on, could afford massive Green New Deals and should have done that decades ago, not right now. So yes,
and indeed they've discovered. So the Australian government and the UK government have both been on this printing money path the last 12 months. So.
Absolutely.
Right, and all the statements about this was going to cause hyperinflation and bankrupt the country, we know it's not the case. Case in point, Japan has the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world and has deflation and negative interest rates. So this threat of inflation for countries that have high degrees of monetary sovereignty, large capacity for productive capacity, and high degrees of technological innovation to actually increase the productive capacity and the efficiency on the climate front, It's nonsensical to say that we can't afford this. But
And
the private sector has its place as a complementary, but we shouldn't count on the private sector to lead the way on a massive effort like this.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I back that completely, but also to say, if you can't see this as an investment into your future, seriously, this is the moment where it all has to happen. So how do you limit the impact of that in that massive transition? Right now, it's putting money into innovation, new jobs, green jobs, whatever you can for regen. Use it as a moment to leverage as a nation. I mean, certainly Biden sees this as a way to get back into the game on climate above, watching, having given away huge amounts of ground internationally to China and Asia. This is it, right? This is the opportunity of the nation to use both crises to pivot and create a different kind of economy. Australia could do the same, many countries could. And you look at, if you want to talk about carbon markets and look at Europe getting on with it, at this point, you almost hear nothing anymore about the carbon market in Europe because it's so embedded into the system that people are just using it as what they need to make that transition, getting on with it, and it's not having a negative impact. They did it early enough that using that as a tool was great. For countries that have left it this late, it's almost too late in the piece to be wildly successful in leveraging that change, particularly if you don't have the political will at the top.
Yeah, and I'm going to come to Paul in a minute, who's over there in the, one of the most progressive and technologically advanced parts of the world, just to comment. But I was going to just share one thing, which is, Fadhel drew out the very important point about the ability of companies to invest, and invest heavily to drive some of this change. And there remains concern about, does this create inflation? Does it what does it do to employment? And in the backdrop of all of this, we've got issues of robotization and the effects that will have on the workforce. And of course, some really fundamental problems that arguably are bigger than climate change in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what on earth we do with our food supply chain. And there is some really interesting work going on at the moment inside the Club of Rome. And this is 50 years on from the original Limits to Growth work. And that work is precisely focused on showing with science or scientific models the interconnection between economies and financial systems on one hand and the natural world on a second, and what's happening in society as a third. And for a sneak preview of that, there's a cool new Netflix film with David Attenborough and Johan Rockström that begins to tell the story that will then leads into this work. So kind of watch that space, because I think that will be really powerful output when it comes. The outputs won't be with us till late this year, early next, but really interesting. But Paul, you're sitting here listening to this discussion from the homeland of technology for the world, or at least one of those homelands. What are you thinking as we've talked about all of this?
Yeah, well, what we're thinking is we've been talking about this for at least 20 years because John Doerr, of Kleiner Perkins, and Vinod Khosla, then of Kleiner Perkins as well, said clean tech, clean technology, climate tech is $1 trillion investment, a money-making opportunity, and started saying that 20 years ago. And slowly it's moved along. Vinod Khosla has funded quite a bit in terms of concrete and how to make evolutions in energy efficient concrete. This is also part of the new innovations. Concrete is 10% of carbon emissions, and we need that if we're building buildings the way we used to instead of maybe the way we need to. Also in the land of technology, there's energy information systems and feedback loops. So just this morning, my wife Gail and I got an email from the utility saying, your energy is running 3 times higher from a year ago. And we're trying to figure it out, actually, like, how is that possible? What is different from a year ago with similar temperatures? But these feedback loops of starting, where are you? Are you above or below a target? Are you like a science-based target? Are you above or below peers in your neighborhood of similar sized houses? Both for industry as well as for everyday people. So in the chat, I've dropped the sciencebasedtargets.org website, because that's where you can find out which companies, but also which governments are pursuing science-based targets. And one of the oldest in Australia and New Zealand is the Auckland Airport. So they actually committed, not just committed to science-based thinking, which is half of the 1,400 globally have said science is important. Hopefully that's true for more than 1,400 companies. But 700 of them globally have set science-based targets. In the US, companies like Stanley Black & Decker, you might find their drills in your garage. Novo Nordisk in Europe, which is a leader in many things sustainability. But also in Australia, New Zealand, 24 of them, including some of the ones, Nigel, that you mentioned earlier, real estate firms and even mining firms. So that's, and so when you track the actual greenhouse gas emissions towards the targets, some are ahead, some are behind. And so this is where carbon markets, all of a sudden, everyone's gotten religion this year on net zero. Can't wait for the net zero tattoo to go around to keep everybody accountable. But net zero, in the best case, is reduction in primary emissions being emitted. But I think a lot of companies and a lot of countries might be speaking to this net zero of let's use carbon offsets and carbon markets to trade them. One thing that has worked, and Tesla continues to make money in this way, is leading manufacturers like Tesla are selling their carbon credits, or at least monetizing their carbon credits. In the US, in the northeast of utility and power production, there's a very active carbon market, and those prices have risen as well. So definitely individual behavior, group behavior, societal behavior through transparency of what's being emitted, performance comparisons and benchmarking, and then accountability to it. And then we're putting a price on it with the carbon market. So it's great to see so many carbon market pricing frameworks and markets emerging. But like Blair said, the main thing is like the time to act is now. We need to dial it up, and we need the companies to fund it, the investors to allocate to it, which there's a new green Bund in Germany that actually did have a premium. So that was covered on Climate and Capital Media, which Blair is a co-editor of. And then, as Fadhel says, the time for the Green New Deal is now to fund it and to invest it into existence.
And I think this is what's really interesting about the idea of a carbon exchange in Australia. You know, irrespective of the kind of background policy environment, if that exchange is set up as a kind of traditional exchange would be, where you as the operator of the exchange has to set rules for who or what can be listed, then that opens the door for innovation in creating new forms of carbon credit for people to buy onshore or offshore. That could be a really powerful step, irrespective of whatever reason has caused this to come about. And this is all this is very real. It's all progressing. There are 3 RFPs out at the moment: one to be the operator of the exchange, one to be the registrar of the units, and the third to conduct a whole bunch of market soundings around what do people actually think. Of course, that, to Blair's point, this will be a really important part of the entire exercise to make sure that whatever emerges from this really fits in with what the market wants. And so it's an unusual experiment in a market-based solution without an awful lot of encouragement coming from the public sector, but the private sector interest is clearly there. Just whilst we're here, of course, if anyone's got any questions, please do put them in the chat. For anyone watching on YouTube, please use the like button and share these messages more broadly. This gets them out to people that might not otherwise hear them. Every press of the like button is worth at least 10 or 12 views. So thank you if you can do that. What else? Blair, where do you think we go from here? I know you have the dark view and I'm bringing the bright and shiny view today, but maybe interesting to talk a little bit about the kind of geopolitics of all of this and how that plays out. In the run up to COP26, etc. Maybe,
worth noting is climate risk as a driver for sure, governance pressures. That is one thing in Australia. The recent APRA report put out draft guidelines on giving people some second phase of guidance on climate risk and how to think about it. This really does kind of scare companies that haven't already acted, for instance, around things like fire, things like extreme weather. You just saw Biden yesterday double the amount that FEMA will have for extreme weather incidents. You know, that's an indicator that not only on the plus side of climate, which is, of course, you know, how do you make the transition happen? How do you benefit from that as a society, but maybe as an industry? But the flip side, of course, is the cost of increasing extreme weather that we're seeing all over the world. So we have still, if you can imagine, after this fire slide that you're seeing, no national climate policy, a minimal resilience and funding for impacts. And without that federal leadership at the top that recognizes that climate's causing it, this is a real challenge for getting real about what it's going to take to get companies and communities prepared for greater impacts. Again, it could be a part of the green jobs package. How to do resilience and preparedness is something that you can invest in communities all around the world locally. It makes good sense to do it now. Infrastructure is at risk. You know, how do we invest in that and make sure it's shored up and the damage that will be done can be minimized? Again, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but we're not seeing it so much here. We are seeing it in some communities. California is having to deal with it, of course. Canada's also been extremely good at investing in resilience and looking at climate risk. So an interesting model might be to look at comparing Canada to parts of the maybe Northern Pacific of the US, and who's going to end up, you know, in a better economic kind of picture with it all, but also in a preparedness and over time, how they fare better as events begin to happen. So that's another big chunk. And we, of course, here are looking at the Pacific as a concern. Refugees and immigration because of climate impacts can't be ignored. Preparing for that is a big issue. I don't know, Fadhel, you want to mention some of the things that are going on in the island nations, but it's a real concern, not just for them, but of course for countries they're going to potentially have to come to when their ability to live on the islands that they're living on comes to an end.
And maybe just
Nigel, Nigel, you need to mute. So there's some major feedback loop happening. So Fadhel, is anybody funding the Green New Deal? Like Korea is moving down this road more quickly, right?
So there are some countries who are moving forward with a bit more aggressive kind of climate action, not exclusively relying on markets and private sector. But to put it in a global context, and Nigel asked me about Pacific Island nations and other developing countries, I'll put a couple of numbers on the table just so we know what we're dealing with. So the IPCC gave us less than 10 years to act on a massive global scale. That's point number one. Point number two, if you divide the world into rich and poor countries and net out all the global financial transactions, including foreign aid and debt cancellation and charity and all of that, FDI and exports and imports, the net amount is $2 trillion a year moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. And this is despite the Global Green Fund and all of that. So we're not even going to put a dent in this climate action from the Global South perspective because of the extraction of wealth and resources that continues to happen, and it's accelerating. Number two, because developing countries don't have the technological capabilities to begin with. Most of those capabilities are in the Global North, maybe to be exported to the Global South if they can pay for it. And number three, developing countries already have a mounting external debt, especially with the COVID crisis now. Most developing countries are rushing to the IMF for emergency lending. So we have all of these crises on the table, and the countries that have the technology, that have the spending capacity, are doing minor, action. We just looked at the map in Australia. I mean, if I'm an insurance company, why would I insure any home in that area? If I'm a bank, why would I finance a mortgage? That's why
the reinsurance companies will take care of it. Don't worry about it.
Well, that's why, as Blair mentioned, that's why FEMA is doubling its resources from the federal government, because we literally have companies refusing to insure properties now in California and and flood zone areas in the Gulf of Mexico and so on. So the market is already saying, we're going to give up on intervention here if you don't do it, because we have massive amount of stranded assets, most of which are, by the way, in the global north, financially speaking, but physical assets all over the world, including oil and gas infrastructure. And then the global south, especially countries that are really on the front lines, literally on the front lines of sea level rises and climate events, with the potential of hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the next few decades as climate refugees. Where are they moving? Moving to the global north. The global north that didn't invest in infrastructure for housing, for resilience, let alone to welcome millions of refugees in the coming decades, in terms of the additional pressure on infrastructure, resources, schools, food supply, and so on. So we haven't even scratched the surface of what needs to be done. So I'm sorry to end on such a dark note, but we're not even close. I mean, for the Australian government and other governments to say, here's a carbon exchange, you, the private sector, do your part, and we're going to sit here and watch and hope for the best. It's laughable.
It's laughable.
Just back to your point about who would reinsure this thing, and this time without feedback, so sorry for that. One of the other things buried in the recent budget was a new risk insurance pool to provide reinsurance for flood risk, and this is cyclone related flood risk, for everything north of the Tropic of Capricorn, which runs about slightly below my nose level on this diagram across Australia. And that is a $10 billion pool of reinsurance that will be available, supported by federal loan, very similar in nature to the structure behind Australia's terrorism reinsurance scheme, which is a or at least partly pre-funded scheme, so very different from the US scheme. So that again is something which has been introduced and somehow is kind of buried in the detail of the budget, but yet quite important, and something we've been advocating for a long time. I mean, maybe not a decade, but certainly 6 or 8 years. And again, will then start to create a kind of feedback loop around, well, if this money is being set aside and this risk is being pooled, are there places where you should invest in advance to address the issues, the kind of preventative maintenance, rather than just picking up the tab when the next very big cyclone, comes in through, from this side of the ocean and wipes out one of the major towns in the northeast of Australia.
And Nigel, that's really the main thing we should take away from at least part of this conversation, is the cost of inaction, which this insurance and reinsurance is part of. The cost of inaction is way more expensive than the cost of doing the right thing. So the cost of doing nothing is much higher than the cost of doing the right thing. And as Amir showed us earlier, the doing the right thing creates jobs that pay well, that are more resilient, that actually help us create the more resilient infrastructure and technology and resources, so we don't have to pay for the consequences of inaction with, as they say, with money, blood, and tears, which is what we're set up to do here with the massive amount of inaction that we have globally on this front.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, how easy is it to bury into what has happened with green jobs in Australia? I'm not across what data is readily available, but it does make you wonder whether there aren't a whole load of jobs just quietly being manufactured in the background that no one's really paying attention to.
Certainly at the state level, lots of that going on. I was going to mention too that the APRA report really shows a shift in that thinking, Fadhel, from this idea of crisis to crisis to how you manage with governance across planning and investment in resilience, et cetera. It's a real shift. And for many businesses, that wouldn't be a surprise, but for the federal government, it's kind of lapping at their door saying, look, we're encouraging all businesses to do this. What about you? I mean, it really has to go hand in glove, that you've got a federal government working with industry for how to prepare for the kind of things that are coming, but also how to cope with the transition and make it work from an economic point of view and a jobs and community point of view. That missing piece of the federal government, clear messaging is frustrating, but it is good to see APRA moving on with it, and clearly companies going with those trends of, the change in thinking using things like TCFD to do real risk analysis, does shine a light on where you're vulnerable, and therefore gives you the opportunity to say, right, it's time to invest in making sure that we're ready. We're trying to do away with the biggest risks, whether they're supply chain, whether they're infrastructure, employees, etc. Even things like preparing for companies to invest in climate risk for their customers has become something that APRA is talking about. So starting to think down the chain about what the impacts will be and how it will impact you, down to how can you help your customer be prepared, because that'll help you in the long run.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, we're coming close to the end now, so maybe we should just do a quick popcorn round for a closing observation or comment on, what should each of us be doing now? Maybe start with Fadhel and go to Blair, and then come back to Paul and then me. What's one thing people should take away and go and act on today?
Well, because of the complexity of these issues, it's multi-pronged type of action for all of us. Low-hanging fruits, what you can do at the local level as an individual in terms of reducing the waste of food and energy, and investing as much as possible in sustainable consumer products. Number two, at the national level, applying more sustained pressure on federal governments around the world, national governments, to take action as opposed to hand the kind of the keys to the private sector and say, you guys fix this for us. Number three, from a personal perspective, from an institutional perspective, where you're investing your retirement matters. And your endowment managers, your pension fund managers, their job is to do their due diligence. And if they're putting your retirement money in potentially stranded assets, then they're not doing you a favor. And this is something that the financial sector as a whole has to deal with, has to reckon with, which is the massive amount of carbon-packed stranded assets that are stacked in their portfolios as we speak. And that needs to be dealt with rapidly. And that's why federal governments have a role to play here. And helping also the financial sector via regulations, not just incentives, via regulations, to cleanse the system of potential stranded assets. Every decision that an oil and gas company is making today to build more infrastructure is guaranteed to be stranded assets, not just in terms of the environmental impact, but also in terms of the 50-year life cycle of the actual resources that they're putting there. It's guaranteed to be a stranded asset, which means they're passing on the costs and the risk to the rest of us from an ecological standpoint, from a financial standpoint. And that just needs to go away. And who's going to regulate this out of existence? It has to be federal governments.
Fantastic advice, Fadhel. Blair, over to you.
Yeah, all three important points, Fadhel, thanks. And it may be a crazy thought, but if you haven't read Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, to open up your view of that real change in using financial mechanisms to solve giant global problems, hand in glove with how people work together, community, society, and how federal governments and international cooperation has to work. I mean, it's interesting to think that cooperation versus competition is now how we will have to work in order to address COVID, certainly climate change, which requires a different structure of how we're operating. So free your mind of the idea that we can only do it this way, because I believe real changes are having to come, because what we have now simply can't deal with the things that Fadhel's talking about, like stranded assets, quickly enough to turn things around. There is no reason we can't turn things around, but we'll need different kinds of structures, financial as well as on the ground, and certainly around jobs, where people are participating in providing the solutions that we need. So that's in many ways very optimistic, because to get there is exciting. It means that we can then deal with all kinds of problems that so far we have really left to say we just can't deal with. It's too big. If we can deal with climate change, what can't we deal with? It's an opportunity as well as a risk. So wrap your arms around it, folks. We're on for the ride.
Fantastic. Paul, over back, and let's cross the Pacific rapidly to Paul.
Sure. Three themes we always campaign for: transparency. Let's get transparency among who's emitting what. And then let's compare them to each other. Let's get some performance comparisons, benchmarks, not only to each other, but to science-based targets. And then accountability. Let's embed accountability into capital markets, into financial incentives, into specific use of proceeds of bonds, into specific greenhouse gas emissions targets for equities, and keep driving those down. If any of you want to get smarter on it, I put back in the chat the top ESG books to read this summer. So you can check those out. Those include like climate impact bonds, environmental impact bonds, and green transition bonds. Those are 3 of the chapters in the Global Handbook of Impact Investing. And then there's several other books to get smart of how to communicate it. Do you call it 51 billion tons a year? Do you call it 51 gigatons a year? What will usually billions of tons sounds like, oh, we got a lot of work to do. Whereas a gigaton is like, oh yeah, we'll knock that out. So, so
just build a gigafactory, it'll be fine.
So get smart, track the metrics, push not only your own portfolio, but push your advisor, your pension, your sovereign wealth fund to allocate towards solutions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. That has been really, quite exciting. Clearly some skepticism and some darkness in there, but lots of opportunity too. Just to add my own tip, and that is ask a Norwegian. When you're trying to do any of these things, there is a huge amount of work out there that has already been done around the problems and what needs to be done to solve them. This is a copy of the original Limits to Growth book 50 years ago. Much of what was in there was basically good advice, and if only we had acted on even a bit of it, we would have less to do now than we do. Looking ahead very briefly to the coming weeks, on the 8th of June, we have a fantastic event to mark World Oceans Day, Clean Break, saying goodbye to single-use plastic. We have Philip Cousteau, Tom Zaki, the founder of TerraCycle, and a host of really interesting people joining us for what I think promises to be a thoroughly intriguing and energizing discussion. Of course, if you want to see any of our previous episodes, they are all there at on ESGX, on the website esgx.org, or go to live.esgx.org. And with that, I think I will say a sincere thank you to everybody who's joined us today. It's been a really wonderful discussion, and I will leave you with a quick preview of what we have got coming up next week. So thanks very much for being here. A single droplet of water running down a leaf, trickling into a stream, or falling into a mountain lake, or slaking the thirst of a single ant, or feeding a flock of birds, or refreshing an elephant, or swirling over a tropical reef. Water is the very essence of life. As a young child, I remember the magic of playing on the beach at the edge of land and ocean. I also remember that this almost always involved tar getting stuck to one of my feet. At the time, I thought that this was just what happened on beaches in the Middle East. I didn't think of the tar as man-made. Since then, the pollution in our waterways and oceans has grown from a trickle to a flood rushing downstream and filling our rivers, our lakes, and our oceans. As you can see from these images, one of the biggest culprits is single-use plastic. From plastic bottles to supermarket aisles to takeaway food to the clothes we wear to the unrelenting use of plastic packaging. Most of us are adding to the waterborne trash heap every single day. But ending all this waste is far from easy. Recycling alone is not enough. Changing our own purchasing habits goes only so far. We need to look upstream at where all the waste comes from and work with entire commercial ecosystems to redefine how we consume. To learn more, join our World Oceans Day special edition of ESGX Live. We're joined by a truly inspirational group of leaders in sustainability to help us understand what is happening in our ocean ecosystems and what we can do individually and collectively to reverse the damage already done. As always, ESGX Live will be uplifting, down to earth and interactive. Register at esgx.org to join our live audience, ask your own questions and contribute your perspectives. We very much look forward to the discussion.